Good morning, everyone. I'm Hope Goins, the Staff Director for the House Homeland Security Committee. Thank you for coming to our panel discussion, Funding the Frontline, hosted by Chairman Bennie Thompson. Today's moderator is Ms. Tiffany Cross. Tiffany Cross is the editor and co-founder of The Beat DC, a daily news publication that highlights the diversity in the nation's capital. Welcome, Ms. Cross.
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
I'll try that again. I grew up in the Baptist church, so I'll try this again. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
I know these are dire times, but we want to have an energetic conversation this morning, and members have votes at 10, so while the chairman has an introduction that could easily go on for 30 minutes, I'm going to be very brief, and just first thank the chairman for having this very important conversation, and I'm delighted to be here. Again, my name is Tiffany D. Cross. I'm the co-founder and managing editor of The Beat DC. If you don't already subscribe, I hope you will after today. And without further ado, I will bring forth Chairman of Homeland Security, Congressman Bennie Thompson.
Thank you very much. Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
You know, I'm of that same religion. You have to talk back. President Trump's shutdown has been going on for over a month now. Remember, this is his shutdown because he said on camera directly to the American people he would take pride in shutting down the government. 800,000 of our federal employees still have no paycheck since last year. They will miss another paycheck tomorrow. Almost all of our frontline workers at DHS are working with no pay. This includes tens of thousands of TSA, transportation, security officers, Coast Guard officers, Border Patrol officers, Secret Service officers, and etc. Democrats in the House are doing the work to fully fund the government. Yesterday, we voted again to reopen the Department of Homeland Security. Quite simply, the shutdown of DHS has undermined the department's ability to secure the homeland, protect the American people, and pay its frontline officers and agents. For example, millions of travelers each day pass through airport security checkpoints staffed by TSOs who aren't getting paid. Many TSOs, some of the lowest paid workers in government, are calling out from work in increasing numbers. Many are now understandably working for paid work to make ends meet. Come tomorrow, they may not be able to pay the first of the month's bills, such as rent or utilities. This has already led to staffing shortages and delays at our nation's airports. The public should know these delays are a direct result of President Trump's shutdown. So we decided to put some additional faces on this shutdown and what the impact will have. My first person who will talk is no stranger to this issue. He's the former Secretary of Homeland Security, Jay Johnson, who has some comments he'd like to offer before our panelists begin. Secretary Johnson.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Chairman Thompson, thank you for the opportunity to be here. I want to acknowledge my former colleagues and friends who were on the panel. And I speak to you this morning not as Secretary of Homeland Security and not as a Democrat. I speak to you as a concerned private citizen and the father of a member of the United States Coast Guard. We are in the midst of a security crisis, and it is one of our own making, frankly. I used to say when I was the leader of Homeland Security that our most valuable security resource are our own people, the very people we depend upon to protect us are the people we are now inflicting a financial insecurity. The very people we depend on for our security are made to suffer by this shutdown, by inflicting stress, hardship, anxiety, and anger into their personal lives and the lives of our family. A breaking point may come tomorrow when they miss a paycheck for the second time this year. As former Administrator Neffenger can tell you, absentee rates at TSA have been as high as 10%. The starting salary of a TSO is something in the range of $28,000. They, like a number of others in the Department of Homeland Security, really do live paycheck to paycheck. Our customs personnel who secure our ports and our airports from dangerous incoming contraband, drugs, and so forth, special interest aliens, are made to suffer as a result of our failure to pass a budget. As Chairman Thompson knows, for years, while I was in office, we fought high attrition rates in the United States Secret Service, and we're able to make lots of progress to turn that around. I fear that this shutdown and the missing paychecks are a huge setback. Our Border Patrol agents have not been paid now for 2 pay periods. They too live pay period to pay period. My own son's shipmates, I fear, are going broke. At basic training in Cape May, New Jersey, recruits are deciding to go to another military service. An assistant U.S. attorney that I know in Florida, who is regarded as essential government personnel, was handed yesterday a memo with options for food banks and relief at churches. From a security standpoint, we are letting our guard down. If this shutdown ended tomorrow, I fear that the damage already done to our security will be months, if not years, as a result, through high attrition, lack of re-enlistment, recruitment efforts have all been set back. A journalist I know and respect told me yesterday that he feared we'd have to wait for a catastrophic event to finally resolve this shutdown. I refuse to accept that. My message to both political parties and both political branches of government: it is time for leadership. It is time to get back to the basic role of governing. The most basic thing our political leaders can do for the people that elect them is to keep the government open and pay the workers. And we are failing at that right now. End this shutdown. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I went to Clark Atlanta University, so I'd be remiss if I didn't say you just heard from a Morehouse man, so thank you. I'm going to introduce our panelists now. And I'm going to start with Vice Admiral Peter, and forgive me if I mess up your last name, Peter Neffenger.
You got it.
Okay, perfect. I practiced last night in the mirror, so good. Tim Manning, who's a former FEMA Deputy Administrator for Protection and National Preparedness. Caitlin, I'm going to try this, Caitlin Durkovich.
Perfect.
Caitlin is the former Assistant Secretary for Infrastructure Protection at the Department of Homeland Security. We also have joining us this morning J. David Cox, Sr. He is the National President of AFGE, that's the American Federation of Government Employees, and I am a former labor organizer, so special welcome to you. Tony Reardon, is joining us, and he's the national president of the National Treasury Employees Union. So I really want this to be an interactive discussion, so I want the opportunity for the audience to be able to weigh in with their questions. So I'm just going to get us started with the first round of questions, and then I'd really like you all to weigh in with your questions as well. And Peter, I'm going to start with you. And the reason why is because I think a lot of us saw the notice yesterday from air traffic controllers and pilots and flight attendants detail the severity of this shutdown. And the line that spoke to me, that jumped out to me the most, is in our risk-averse industry, we cannot calculate the level of risk currently at play, nor predict the point at which the entire system will break. It's unprecedented. And they were speaking specifically to the shutdown. You also spent some time in the Coast Guard as well. And we heard from the Coast Guard yesterday detailing the stress that its members are feeling. And I was just saying backstage that when people can't feed their families or themselves, things can get dangerous. But another dangerous point is our airlines. We've got things like the Super Bowl coming up, but then we have things like everyday travel. If you could detail us your introduction remarks on what you think is happening now and your assessment of the path forward.
Okay, thank you. And thank you to Chairman Thompson for the invitation to be here today. And I would echo the comments of former Secretary Johnson with respect to the concerns. I too appear as a private citizen and also as a retired member of the United States Coast Guard. I served for 34 years in the Coast Guard, and then following that, almost 2 years as the administrator of TSA. To address directly what your first question, I will tell you this, and I know this because I know these people. I worked closely with Coast Guard men and women throughout my career, and I worked very closely with members of the Transportation Security Administration, particularly the Frontline Transportation Security Officers. Those are the uniformed folks that you see every day. And if they're on the job, they'll do the job, and they'll show up, and they want to do the job. And I've had lots of conversations over the past month with people in those positions. But I would agree that there is a point at which there's a breaking point. I don't know where that is, and I don't know what that is, but when you're not making a lot of money to begin with, and whether you're a junior enlisted member of the United States Coast Guard, a junior officer, or a member of the TSA, your starting pay, and for many of the first years you're in, is relatively low. So there comes a point at which you just have to take care of yourself. It's interesting to me, it's surprising and unfortunate that we have to have a discussion about funding essential government services. And I say they're essential because by definition they're essential because ever since the establishment of any of the agencies that are currently affected by the shutdown, this body, Congress, and every single president has affirmed and reaffirmed their right to exist and their need. So I say it's essential by definition because the elected officials representing the American public have said that these are services that they want. And if I speak specifically to the two agencies I'm most familiar with, the Coast Guard and the Transportation Security Administration, when you look at the transportation system of the United States, I think that it's fair to say that it is one of the key essentials to economic health of this country. And its safety and security is what those two agencies are pledged to protect, in addition to, with the Coast Guard, protecting the maritime boundaries of the United States and all that that entails and implies. So there clearly are impacts. And again, as I said, it's interesting that we're discussing impacts, and we've been reading about them for some time now. But the first and most important impact, and the highest impact, of course, is to the people that are asked by their country to do this job. And I think it's important to remember that every single person who raises their hand and takes an oath of office, the same oath of office that every member of Congress takes, that every member of the executive branch takes, that every president has taken, and it's the one that begins, I pledge to support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. But there's a very interesting additional follow-on line, and it's the one that says, I take this obligation freely without any reservation or purpose of evasion. It's important to remember they take it freely. So these are people who said, I really want to serve my country. And that's a contract that we have now with them because the other side of that is the promise then to take care of them as they're serving their country. And remember, these are people who have asked to do, in the case of the Coast Guard and the TSA, some of the hardest work this country has. and some of the most thankless work this country has, but it's some of the most important work. And you know that because they keep getting reauthorized, and we know how people look to them. So they've promised to do their job, and they will continue to do their job because it's important to them, and people have said that to me as I've gone through. But remember, these hard jobs are not just challenging because you're asked to get underway on ships. You know, in an average Coast Guard career, it's not unusual to spend a third of your career away from family and friends, far away from family and friends. Everyone knows that the TSA has been, at best, the butt of late-night comic jokes and derision at worst. But yet, these are people who show up every day. And think about it: if you're the face of government, and I would argue that TSA is largely the face of government, you see roughly 2 to 2.5 million people a day coming through airport checkpoints. If you're at a large airport, the average TSO, the uniformed officer, will individually see some 1,500 people during a shift. And every one of those people needs to be treated with respect and dignity, and at the same time cleared for entry, because collectively you want to make sure that people feel safe and secure in their travels. So to fail to pay people who have done these hard things, I think is unconscionable. That, in turn, applies against the agencies that are then asked to do. So those are members of agencies that do these missions. So mission and readiness obviously begin to suffer. Again, I don't know what the breaking point is, but at some point, if you can't fuel aircraft and you can't put food on board the ships and you can't repair things that break, then suddenly you can't do the jobs, the basic jobs you've been asked to do, important jobs. It's hard to maintain recruitment. Secretary Johnson mentioned that we've already seen instances of people who've gone to recruit training, boot camp at Cape May, New Jersey for the Coast Guard, people who've not yet been paid by the Coast Guard because they started boot camp after this government shutdown, who've been asked to go home because there's no more pay to keep them there, and they've had to fund their own way home, and some of those people will likely choose to go someplace else. Long-term workforce, I suspect that you'll begin to lose people who've got talent and capability because they'll need to find other opportunities. Not that they want to, but they'll need to. And then there's all those little things that just don't get done, all the opportunity costs of not having the ability to go to work. So the overall impact is one of uncertainty on the part of the American public, uncertainty on the part of the individuals being asked to do this job, the very real and tragic individual cases of personal hardship, and they're countless. They're probably as numerous as there are people who are currently not being paid. And then ultimately, my concern as a citizen is undermining some faith and confidence in the ability of the government to provide these essential services. So I would leave it at that, and I'm happy to follow on with any specifics.
Thank you, and I definitely have some follow-up questions, but I'll let the audience weigh in, and I want to make sure everyone gets a chance to give introduction remarks. So I'm going to jump around a little bit and go to Tim Manning. As a reminder, he's a former FEMA administration official. So Tim, if you could set the frame for us on what you think of this government shutdown and its impact on FEMA.
Great, sure will. Thank you. I also want to thank Mr. Chairman for having us all here to talk about this topic. I mean, it's unbelievably critical to the public, to the American public, not just the men and women of the Department of Homeland Security, but the whole nation. And so before I start, I as well have speaking as a private citizen on behalf of my former colleagues and friends across the entire emergency management community. Like Admiral Neffenger, I spent the 8 years of the Obama administration as Deputy Administrator at FEMA. I'm a lifelong emergency manager, emergency responder, and I've worked with people my entire career, and I can tell you from the start that the women and men of the Federal Emergency Management Agency and the entire federal government are tireless, selfless public servants. They choose to do this for the value to their friends and family, to protect their neighbors. They don't do it for reward. They don't do it for riches. They do it to serve each other, and they definitely deserve better. In the context of FEMA, I think it's important to understand to begin with that FEMA, as you think of as an agency, is well, one of those organizations that's unthought of in the first place until something bad happens. It's not an agency that often comes to mind on a sunny, clear afternoon. But it's beyond just the Federal Emergency Management Agency. The federal government's emergency response capability is the entire executive branch. It's every department and agency across the government. FEMA is the coordinator of that effort. And I fear that in this shutdown, aside from the impacts that we're having on the individuals that work in the agency and the interagency that supports disaster response in the United States, it's having a long-term, extremely detrimental effect on the nation's preparedness and ability to respond to disasters and acts of terrorism within the United States. Secretary Johnson mentioned his fear that it might require a catastrophic incident to snap us out of this. And my fear is that with the effect that the shutdown is having on FEMA and the nation's ability to react to a crisis, there'd be nobody there to deal with it. An important thing to understand about FEMA is that unlike a lot of other agencies where you see people who are determined to be exempt or classified as essential that are working selflessly for no pay, where you can exempt entire classes, say law enforcement, people that work for day-to-day in enforcing the nation's laws. In FEMA, the people that do disaster response are all dual-hatted people. They're people who are on day-to-day executive assistance or managing contracts or managing a training center. Disaster response, crisis management is not their day job, so they're not able to be exempted. They're not on the job working for free. They're home furloughed without a paycheck. Furthermore, actually prohibited by law from checking their emails every day. So when there is a crisis, when there is a big disaster, Hurricane Katrina, Hurricane Sandy, Hurricane Maria, Hurricane Harvey, those are all hands-on-deck missions. Every single person in the Federal Emergency Management Agency and a whole lot of people across the Department of Homeland Security and every other federal agency change their day jobs to do disaster response, and they're not there. They're not at work right now. They're home. In 2013, during that short shutdown, the tropical storm Karen was coming ashore in the Gulf of Mexico. 3 or 4 days into that shutdown, and we had to do a snap recall of a number of people. The folks that are considered exempt that are at the agency right now are the ones that are watching what's happening. They're doing situation monitoring, but there are not enough of those people to do the response. We had to pull those people back. That was extraordinarily difficult 3 or 4 days into that shutdown. A month into this one, I'm not sure how we'd reach everybody. As I mentioned, the men and women of the agency, of the emergency management community are selfless, tireless public servants, but the tragic thing, the thing I'm hearing most from people as I talk to folks that are still in the agency, they love that mission. They absolutely love being the last best hope for people when they're at their most dire, when there is a major catastrophic incident in their home, in their community. FEMA is the last place that is there to help them. And the people that work at FEMA love that mission. And without exception, the people I've talked to are looking for new work. They're destitute about it. They're despondent about it. They don't want to leave, but they can't not find new work. They need to pay their bills, they need to pay their mortgage, and they need something more stable. And that is a loss to the nation that will be hard to fill. At the same time, there's stopped work on all contracts. There's no training. Millions of first responders a year trained by FEMA at the Center for Domestic Preparedness in Anniston, the Emergency Management Institute the Center for Domestic Preparedness in Alliston, Alabama, the Emergency Management Institute and the National Fire Academy in Emmitsburg, Maryland, are all closed. It'll take years to backfill, to get that training back started again, and to get the people who have lost that opportunity back through those training opportunities. These are advanced first responder trainings that we are weaker as a nation without. Disaster recovery work has stopped around the country. The rebuilding from disasters in Puerto Rico has stopped. The contracts have been stopped. The list goes on and on. I fear that this will have long-lasting months, as the Secretary said, possibly years to recover from. In the meantime, I fear that we are rolling the dice we will be lucky to get everybody back on the job without a crisis striking that we're not able to respond to. And I feel for all of my former colleagues at the agency and across the department, across the government through this time. And it's time then to shut down and get back to work. Thanks.
Thank you, Tim. So before everyone runs out to get bunker, I want to get through this quickly and get to Caitlin. So, and just a reminder that Tim served in his capacity during the entire term of the Barack Obama administration. So by all means, you are certainly a subject matter expert, so that's a dire warning. Caitlin, who, as a reminder, a DHS official during Barack Obama's second term, worked under Secretary Jay Johnson. Please frame the discussion for us.
Thank you very much, Tiffany, and I want to thank Chairman Thompson, former Secretary Jay Johnson, members of the House Homeland Security Committee, and all members of Congress and staff that are here today. More importantly, I want to thank the federal employees that are on the front lines, whether exempt or non-exempt. The work that you do is vitally important to our national and economic security. I am here today to talk about the impacts of the partial shutdown on the Homeland Security enterprise and the public-private partnership that protects our nation's critical infrastructure from cyber and kinetic threats. I am here appearing as a private citizen, but for nearly 8 years, I had the honor and the privilege of serving at the Department of Homeland Security and working in partnership with the owners and operators of our nation's infrastructure, the electric grid, communications, financial services, transportation, water, chemical, health, and many other industries, as well as partners at the state and local level in mitigating risks to our nation's critical infrastructure. As each day passes, though, the strategic risk to our nation continues to grow, both from the threats that led to the establishment of the Department of Homeland Security, but in cyberspace and other emerging domains. We rely on an antiquated definition of imminent threat and one that is not cognizant of the risk environment we live in, driven by adversaries and bad actors, directed and inspired by nation-state and non-state actors that do not follow norms and, more importantly, operate on a strategic doctrine less concerned about immediate consequences, but focused on headlines, gaining footholds that will serve as a channel to escalate, to de-escalate, and ultimately dividing our country. These active and persistent threats are not considered imminent under current appropriation laws, which means the preparedness efforts we engage in with the Homeland Security enterprise have been significantly reduced, if not come to a halt. Preparedness and resilience are integral to the Homeland Security mission, and if we are unable to understand and take steps to mitigate risk early, we will lose critical momentum. We should take solace that the Homeland Security employees on duty without pay are doing an exemplary job in the essential blocking and tackling that needs to occur every day. On the cyber front, the National Cybersecurity Communications and Integration Center, the civilian government's hub for cybersecurity information sharing, incident response, and coordination for both critical infrastructure and the federal government, is operational in managing major risks. Federal networks are being protected and the important DNS security work continues, especially at the large departments and agencies that remain reasonably staffed and have the ability to manage key systems and keep cyber hygiene up. Federal civilian network intrusion detection and prevention capabilities have not been interrupted. Most of the federal security operations centers, facilities where security information is housed, monitored, and analyzed to protect data from cyber threats are also up and running. But the preparedness work and the conduct of election and census system vulnerability assessments, for example, have ceased because they cannot be tied to emergencies involving the safety of human life or the protection of property. On the physical side, protective security advisors and others in the field continue to provide federal support to major public gatherings, from the recent New Year's Eve celebration in Times Square to the security for the Super Bowl in Atlanta on February 3rd and events beyond, to include Mardi Gras, the Daytona 500, and the NBA All-Star Game. More than 9,000 federally owned and leased facilities remain under the guard of the Federal Protective Service, whether they are occupied with federal employees or not. But our strategic risk efforts and security awareness campaigns are on hold, despite the recent ISIL attacks against American citizens in Syria, the continuing threats to schools and places of worship, and active and persistent cyber threats. The diminishment of our intelligence capability and inability to raise awareness about emergent threats does leave us vulnerable. And many of our private sector partners that have developed and deployed innovative anti-terrorism plans, policies, and technologies through the Safety Act to manage risk and litigation stand to lose their certification and designation as their renewal applications go unprocessed. Many other vital strategic initiatives have been impacted. For example, while the chemical facility anti-terrorism inspectors continue to monitor threats to chemical facilities, we are unable to do enforcement. Partnerships have been impacted. We have asked our private sector partners to help us address emergencies such as fuel resiliency, supply chain risk, position navigation and timing, electromagnetic pulse, and many others. These projects are now on hold. The rollout of continuous diagnostic and monitoring, which helps our departments and agencies improve their cybersecurity posture, has been delayed. Enterprise initiatives at the department, such as the migration from data centers to the cloud, something that our employees, or that the department's employees have been working very hard on, are also on hold. And many of the equities that this very committee fought hard to give to the new Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency are being challenged by interagency partners in the absence of DHS at the table, and planning has been impeded for future capability development. Finally, and equally important, I want to speak to the human impact, much like Pete and Tim have already acknowledged. Let me start with contractors. Many of the cyber and infrastructure protection missions depend on contractors. Some have been given stop work orders, others continue to work without invoices being paid. This is particularly devastating for smaller contractors, the very businesses that DHS has worked hard to cultivate over the last several years. Many will never recover, laying off or losing employees or simply going out of business. These contractors have built relationships, they have long-standing knowledge, and have gone through the arduous vetting process and are cleared for work. I cannot underscore the enormous impact their potential absence will have on DHS missions, particularly cyber. And finally, the federal workforce, the men and women that I called my family for 8 years. Most of the federal Homeland Security employees work at the department because of the desire to serve their country, because of the national security mission and the stability of a paycheck. We have taken away the stability of a paycheck, and we have called into question the importance of this Homeland Security mission. There are reports that recruiters are starting to poach the best talent in the department, and the pipeline is in doubts. I know that many of you in the room understand our hiring challenge, and the shutdown only exacerbates the problem. And I'm sorry, when I say I still speak as a member of the Department of Homeland Security, even though I am a private citizen. There is anecdotal evidence that recruiters are calling that talent is getting offers. We are going to lose continuity and knowledge. And from a recruiting standpoint, we have been significantly impacted. Most recently, the department was told that it could not attend the Scholarship for Service event, a major recruiting opportunity for junior employees. The rest of the intelligence community was there, the FBI was there, but DHS was not, and our pipeline will take a hit. Finally, with every passing day, the impact grows more significant. As we near the 30-day mark, it is going to be difficult to restart projects, to ensure contractor continuity, again, especially for small businesses. Dormancy is going to create challenges with PIV cards, with our unclassed networks, and so when the shutdown ends and we call employees back to work, there's going to be startup time that is required to get everybody back into their seats. The critical mission of the Department of Homeland Security should certainly be exempt from lapses in funding, but the bottom line is we cannot allow a government shutdown to happen again. It is bad for our national security, our economic security, and catastrophic for the people who have answered the call to service and defend our front lines every day. I do want to thank Senator Warner for introducing a bill to make sure that shutdowns never happen again, and I hope that the House will take up similar legislation. Thank you.
Thank you, Caitlin. Lots of follow-up questions for you, but I'll keep moving and we'll revisit that. Mr. Cox, with AFG. You actually have a lawsuit against the administration right now, so very curious your thoughts to help frame this discussion.
Thank you very much. And again, thank Chairman Thompson, who has been a true leader for the employees and Homeland Security and been a true leader of working men and women in this country. You can see my hair is gray. And there's two events that have occurred in my life that I can tell you exactly where I was at and what I was doing. One was the assassination of President Kennedy. I was in Mr. Foster's 7th grade science class when a 6th grade teacher, Betty Christie, came in and said, "It's true, the president has been assassinated." And I suspect there's others in this room that can give you the exact memory of that occurrence. And I can tell you exactly where I was at. On 9/11, I was at a Hilton Hotel in the Georgetown area, close to the Potomac, and folks came into the room and said, "The Pentagon is on fire, the World Trade Towers are on fire," and I couldn't get my cell phone to work, and I thought surely the end of time was coming very quickly that day. And I saw this country come to a screeching halt with every plane in the sky being grounded. Following that, we saw the bankruptcy of many of the airlines. We saw a devastation to our economy, and many things occurred and happened. Why? Because of the security of the screening of passengers at the airports. The people of this country demanded, the airline industry demanded that be federalized, be managed and operated by the federal government as we do other law enforcement for the protection and the well-being of this country. And TSA was created. Yes, more government employees were created under a Republican president, a Republican Congress. However, they were created as second-class government employees without Title V rights or pay. They are some of the lowest paid government employees, starting at about $28,000. And those that have now been there 16, almost 17 years, their top pay is $40,000 a year. These are the most dedicated men and women that I have ever had the opportunity to meet and to work with. And I know the former administrator over here will tell you, you get them in a room, 10 hours later, they will be discussing how detailed and how involved they are in their work and the passion of their work. They love their work immensely. But at the same token, that's not a lot of money. And is there a person in this country that can say they have not done a superb job accomplishing what their mission was? Because we've had no incidents in any way, shape, or form. They have handled it. Even some at their own risk, and some have lost their lives. They wear the uniform, and they proudly wear it. However, there's no uniform allowance coming. There is no money to even buy the laundry detergent to wash that uniform. We received information yesterday in Honolulu, in the entire state of Hawaii, they are receiving a large number of resignations from transportation security officers. It's one of the highest cost of living in our country. They can't afford to go to work without pay. TSA being some of the lowest paid federal employees, second-class citizens without Title V rights or Title V pay, again, The turnover is approximately 20% a year. So since this government lockout, as I prefer to call it, has started, there's been between 1,800 officers that would just normally have left the agency and no one coming back in to fill, and others are leaving at a higher rate. And at the same token, look at the work that they do. No one wants to stand in a line at an airport, at a ball game, or anything in the world. That's our human nature. We want to move through. They are working very quickly. They do a superb job. But I had asked any of you, kind of look at those screens, and if you can figure out what they're seeing and how they immediately know to pull this bottle of water out, I think they are super fantastic people that's keeping this country safe. And they do it with such great work and professionalism. But they cannot continue to exist and survive. Come the first of the month, they're not even going to get transit subsidy, even though there seems to be some bannering backwards and forwards. Let's talk about New York City. Let's talk about here in the nation's capital. Most of those employees use public transportation to get there. There's just not readily available parking. It's a very difficult situation. They're having to figure out if they're going to be able to feed their children, pay their rent. How are they going to survive? And let's go back. The very senior ones, the highest paid ones, are making about $40,000 a year. Subtract out about a third of that in taxes, and you can start figuring out very, very quickly. It's a struggle. How are they going to continue to come to work to do that when they're standing in soup lines? Airline employees are bringing in pizzas and feeding the men and women of this country that is keeping us safe and preventing another 9/11 from ever occurring again in this country. That is unconscionable, it's a disgrace, and it is a shame on this country that we are allowing these type things to happen. And when it comes back to hiring, how are we going to get people wanting to apply for those jobs? It takes a long time to recruit and train these folks and to have mentors to get that work done. We're losing a lot of experience. We are getting very frayed at the edges. I, too, share the concerns that our air traffic controllers, the airline industry, are sharing. And I believe we are moving very swiftly to a breaking point in TSA. And I'd go back to a comment earlier. There's all this data gathering, and you've got the experts in this room that's much, much better than me, that understand there are people in this world that would love to harm this country, and they know exactly what's going on in this country because it's all we're talking about in this country right now. So it's time to end this government lockout, pay federal employees for the great job that they are doing, and allow Congress to do all the other things that they need to be doing and to work through our checks and balances. And I call upon the President and I call upon the Majority Leader in the Senate to move forward with some legislation, and the House has sent a full gambit of a buffet that they can pick from. So it's time to move some legislation in the Senate and protect this country and to protect our economy and protect the jobs of working men and women. And I will close also because in this government lockout, we've talked a lot about border security. According to the data and information that we have today, there are 2,000 less Border Patrol agents employed and on the job today than there was 2 years ago. I am not sure exactly what maybe occurred almost 2 years ago, the day or two here. I'll let y'all figure that out. 2,000 less Border Patrol agents. You can't have border security, you can't have transportation security without the human resources of the people doing the job. Thank you so much.
And thank you. Thank you for the work that you do. And you framed it up beautifully. There's currently 2 competing bills being voted on this morning. The House has voted numerous times to reopen the government. So thank you for framing that. I too remember where I was when President Kennedy was assassinated. I was a twinkle in my mother's eye. So we'll move on. Next to Tony Reardon, who is, as a reminder, the national president of the National Treasury Employees Union, and a lot of people are filing taxes. It's tax season. People are waiting to get their IRS return checks. So I'm sure a lot of people in the audience are very curious your thoughts on the current situation.
Okay, thank you very much. Chairman Thompson, thank you for inviting me to discuss what I believe really are the devastating impacts this month-long shutdown is having on the lives of the employees of the Department of Homeland Security's Customs and Border Protection, Office of Field Operations, CBP Office of Trade, and the Federal Law Enforcement Training Centers, who are represented by the National Treasury Employees Union. Since the start of the shutdown, over 25,000 CBP officers and agriculture specialists who are responsible for border security at 328 air, sea, and land ports of entry, ensuring legitimate trade and travel efficiency, processing asylum seekers who present themselves at our ports of entry, as well as stopping illicit trafficking in people, drugs, illegal weapons, and money. They've all been working without pay. Many of our non-uniform trade operations specialists responsible for trade compliance and collecting over $47 billion annually in duties, taxes, fees, and other revenue have been furloughed, as have some FLETC, Federal Law Enforcement Training Center, instructors who train federal law enforcement officers for every single agency. As I've told Congress on many occasions prior to the shutdown, CBP employees at the ports are chronically understaffed. According to CBP, an additional 2,516 CBP officers need to be funded and hired in order to meet the current staffing needs at our nation's ports of entry. Since 2015, CBP officers have been required to work excessive overtime and have been sent on temporary duty assignments to the critically understaffed southwest border ports. Now, these officers are working excessive overtime and are working away from home on TDY assignments without pay. At CBP's Office of Trade, responsible for the implementation of trade agreements and assessing trade duties and tariffs, many employees are furloughed. CBP itself states that every dollar invested in CBP trade personnel returns $87 to the U.S. economy by lowering the costs of trade and protecting innovative intellectual property. Today, they are prohibited from doing their jobs, jobs that are vitally important to the nation's economic security. At FLETC, half the instructors are working without pay to train new law enforcement officers for agencies that have been funded in 2019, and for unfunded agencies whose trainees are considered essential. The remainder, they're furloughed. With hiring at a standstill, class sizes are significantly smaller, and the training candidate supply will, of course, eventually end for unfunded agencies. Our members are marking 1 month without a paycheck. Many of those are working excessive overtime, including forced double shifts without pay. Not only are they worrying about paying their family's monthly living expenses, but also for paying for gas in their cars to get to work and for child care to take care of their children. Also, until the shutdown ends, credit card and housing expenses for those on TDYs to the southwest border land ports and stationed at pre-clearance ports in Abu Dhabi, Ireland, Canada, and the Caribbean must now be paid from personal accounts, not government accounts. Furloughed CBP and FLETC members are facing similar financial challenges. You hear their stories in the media. We all hear their stories in the media each and every day. It is time to reopen the government and to get these government employees paid. I want to be clear. This absolutely does not mean that we don't support border security. In fact, our members and NTEU strongly support border security. And that's exactly why we have fought for many, many years for additional funding for CBP, for more staffing at the ports, to fix the hiring process so employees can be brought on much more quickly and efficiently, and for better equipment, pay, and benefits for all CBP employees. All of this contributes to a stronger border. CBP employees I represent are frustrated that the government leaders seemingly do not recognize that securing the nation's ports of entry is just as vital to border security as is securing the border between the ports of entry, and that the ports are an economic driver of the U.S. economy. It is imperative, in fact, it is critically important for the entire government to be funded and to be reopened today, so that all federal workers can do the jobs that they are so committed to doing and to be paid for that vitally important work. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Thank you all for helping to frame the discussion. I'm going to ask a round of questions while you all gather your thoughts to ask a question. Thank you, Secretary, for joining us today. While you all gather your thoughts for questions. And Peter, I'm going to revisit you first, just because it's something that keeps me up at 3 in the morning, and I'm curious if it keeps you up at 3 in the morning. Again, you spoke about this a little bit in your introduction. But, I mean, we all, read that memo from air traffic controllers and pilots and flight attendants. I mean, just in a word, right now, given the current state of affairs, is it safe to fly?
As I said before, if people are on the job, then they're doing the job and it's safe to fly. And I fly a lot still. In fact, I've flown through a dozen airports since the shutdown commenced, and I've spent a lot of time interacting. I mean, there are people in the TSA who still recognize who I am, so we talk, and I ask them how they're doing. And to a person, I mean, there's various versions of this same answer. It's and I'll echo what Jay David just said. These are people who really love what they do. They're very good at what they do. It's a really challenging job. That's why they love what they do, and they're committed to continuing to do it. But in the same breath, they say, but we don't know how long we can go without getting paid. So I'll just echo what I said before. Somewhere out there is a breaking point. I don't know where it is. I think it will be as far out as any individual can push themselves because they care about what they do. I know that. Like I said, I serve with these people. And the same goes for the members of the Coast Guard, who often don't even have the option to quit their job and find another job because of the commitment you make when you join the military. So I'm not worried about flying right now. As long as I see a TSO on the job, I know the job's being done. My fear is that there comes a point where you can't get enough TSOs to come back because you're not paying them, and people just have to work. And if there's a higher incidence of people not showing up, my suspicion is it's because they need to find work to pay for their job. It costs money to work, as we all know. So yes, I think it's safe to fly right now. I continue to fly. I'm flying tomorrow, and I look forward to seeing my former colleagues when I do. But I'm concerned that at some point out there, you just kind of run out of options. So.
Well, while it might be safe, it might not be convenient. We've seen airports close terminals because of a lack of people showing up. We've got, like I said, the Super Bowl coming up in Atlanta. The Atlanta Mayor, Keisha Lance Bottoms, was in town, and she assures everybody that Atlanta is prepared to welcome people to attend the Super Bowl. But we've seen a lot of reports about people waiting in line 2 or 3 hours. So I think a lot of people are assured that you say it's safe. But I do want to echo the point that you said you don't know when there's a breaking point without these folks getting paid. Caitlin, you spoke a lot about cybersecurity, which I think is something that does not get a lot of discussion in the mainstream media, but certainly something we should all be paying attention to. Certain cybersecurity experts have called this shutdown a welcome mat for hackers. So you talked about certain programs that are still ongoing, but certainly there are some gaps given the shutdown and how that's impacted the work that you talked about. You've also spent time in the private sector engaging across the executive branch and leading projects that touch on everything from FEMA to other executive agencies. What keeps you up at 3 in the morning, given the shutdown?
Tiffany, great question. Let me just start with your initial kind of premise. I do think that over the course of the last several years, thanks in part to the hard work of the men and women of the Department of Homeland Security, we have helped propel the issue of cybersecurity into the mainstream. And that's both part of the work that they do to protect federal civilian networks, but in some ways more important, the outreach, the partnerships that happen with the private sector and across all of the various industries and sectors. I think again, as I mentioned in my comments, I take solace in the fact that the NCIC, something that was stood up during the Obama administration and is really the hub for coordinating all cybersecurity activity, is operational. There are hundreds of cybersecurity federal employees who are on duty, working without pay, making sure that we are protecting federal networks, again, doing the basic blocking and tackling. And so it's, but as I mentioned, I think the concern is more of the strategic and the emergent risk. I mean, look, at the end of the day, our adversaries are very capable, they're very smart, they approach opportunity a little bit differently than I think sometimes how we think about defense, and they look for soft targets, right, the weak link in the chain. And as someone mentioned earlier, I can guarantee you they follow every day with great interest what is happening in this country, and are looking for opportunities to exploit where there might be weakness or softness. And so there is a lot of important work that is happening. This is both kind of on the cyber side, but also some of the more systematic aspects of what we do. But you know, a campaign and an initiative to look at supply chain security and the parts that go into many of the critical networks and systems that, you know, underpin our infrastructure, and that work has stopped. I think it was 18 months ago, the president declared that we had a national emergency around fuel security and discussed rethinking how the markets work related to kind of nuclear and coal, and there was a question around that. And so a big effort has been around fuel resiliency. Well, that national emergency apparently is no longer an emergency and is now on hold. And the list goes on.
Sorry to interrupt you, Caitlin, but you mentioned our adversaries. Are there any adversaries you care to name? So I think that there's two buckets. There's our nation-state friends who continue to,
their capability, their sophistication it continues to increase, and that's kind of the four horsemen, Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. But as much as I say that in one breath, I still remain very concerned about the lone offender. ISIL has not been defeated, and we became acutely aware of that earlier this month. They have very sophisticated social media campaigns to recruit and target soft targets. And I still remain very concerned about terrorist-inspired event, the lone offender that sits in their basement and then decides at the right time that I'm going to go out and strike. You pick the soft target.
But the president has said that we defeated ISIS, so you're saying we have not?
Based on recent events, I would say that ISIL has not been defeated. Yes, ma'am.
And we also recently saw that the DNC has come out and said that they were attacked immediately after, or there were hackers who attempted to attack their systems immediately after midterms in November. And this is just, the campaign arm of the political party. Do you think our nation's infrastructure is prepared during this government shutdown to address any attempted attacks by some of our adversaries currently?
I am very optimistic about the capacity that we have built in many of the sectors, and that is really, at the end of the day, the work and the mission of this new cyber security and infrastructure security agency that used to be inaptly named the National Protection and Programs Directorate. We've worked for years in helping our partners in the private sector understand emerging threats, understand the importance of protecting their facilities and their networks, and giving them tools and information that both helps protect their businesses, but kind of the broader national security bent. So I am confident that we have a strong posture, but as more time goes on and as we are unable to do some of these key preparedness campaigns around emerging and strategic threats, we become less prepared. I will tell you, though, that the owners and operators of critical infrastructure, whether from the private sector or the state and local angle, do understand the importance of their role and work hard every day to make sure that they're doing their end. They just rely on us. Again, I'm sorry, I apologize. They rely on the Department of Homeland Security for critical information and mitigation strategies. And if we are unable to provide that, that's where we start to fall short.
Thank you. Tony, I want to revisit something that you said. You talked about the importance of border security being as important as the work that you do. And this week, there's been a lot of reporting on furloughed workers who specifically IRS employees who, under contract, are well within their right to not return to work, if I understand it correctly. Like I said in my introduction with you, it's tax season. And so a lot of people, I think all of us in this room get paid to consume the minutia of this, government shutdown every single day. But when you look out across the country, not everybody knows what's going on. All they know is they're not getting a paycheck. And some people are concerned about they may not get their tax returns. So you said a lot about border security. I'm curious your thoughts specifically on what's going to happen, what you can say to the American people who are concerned, one, about getting their tax returns. Is that going to be impacted? And two, about the IRS employees who under contracts are within their right to not return to work without pay.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Let me just first say about, I believe this about all federal employees, but since you're asking me about IRS employees, let me just say that, these are some of the most mission-focused people that you can ever imagine. And, by the tens of thousands, they have been called back to work, and they've reported. And I think that's important to recognize. These folks want to do the work of the American people, and they work And they work extraordinarily hard to make sure that they are providing a service to the American public, to the taxpayers in the United States of America. What you're asking me about is something that it is a legal right that they have that is contained in the agreement between the Internal Revenue Service and NTEU, which is a hardship exemption. And essentially what it does is it provides the employee, if they have a financial hardship, something significant enough that they literally cannot get into work, they have that right to exercise that exemption in the agreement. What we have instructed our employees, our members, is that when you get called back to work, you are to go back to work. That is your responsibility as an employee. And like I said, by the tens of thousands, these employees have done exactly that. Now, in terms of, what should the American public be thinking about whether or not they're going to receive their tax returns on time? Clearly, I think that is probably best asked of the Internal Revenue Service. But here's what I will tell you, that, even prior to the shutdown, if you go back to what has happened from 2010 to the present, the IRS has lost 23,000 employees. As a result, and let me also add, has lost $715 million in funding. So I believe even going into the shutdown, the IRS was in a very vulnerable position. Then you had the situation with the new tax reform legislation. And I think the IRS didn't have enough people, didn't have the funding to really carry out everything that was going to be required for that as effectively as they otherwise would have been. Got to have a lot of training in order to train the IRS employees to deal with all of the questions, the millions of questions that are going to come in about the tax reform legislation, new tax laws. Biggest tax reform legislation in 30 years, I might add. And that training, I've heard from our members, was antiquated, it wasn't sufficient. And then we have the shutdown. So the training stops, whatever folks were trained in advance of the shutdown, many of them were out of work for almost a month, so they have to be retrained. And so it really creates a difficult situation, and I think delays a lot of things. And so as a citizen, I would certainly be concerned about whether or not the tax season, which is supposed to start on January 28th, is the IRS really ready to carry out the tax season? And as a result, what does that mean for tax refunds? I don't personally know the answer to that, but I think there is certainly reason to wonder if they will go out timely. But like I said, that's really something the IRS itself needs to answer.
Okay, thank you. Tony, so can you talk us through, I'm sorry, not Tony, forgive me, David. Can you talk us through, you currently have a lawsuit against the administration. Can you talk us through, one, where that stands, and two, many of your employees, it's been reported, only make about $500 a week. And so I can certainly understand when you make $500 a week, when you miss one paycheck, it can certainly impact your entire financial situation. One, what are your workers doing to make ends meet? What are you saying to your members who are missing paychecks? I understand PayPal came out and has offered interest-free loans for some of the AFG members. So yeah, tell us the state of mind. I know all of us tend to talk about the politics of it all, but we forget about the real life people. Sometimes these things are conceivable in the many when we look at people in data, but you're talking to individuals whose lives are directly impacted. So can you tell us what your members are going through and how they're surviving, literally?
It's like $500 take-home pay. I want to be clear of that, not making $500, but $500 take-home pay, which is not a lot of money.
You mean after taxes?
After
This is what it's going
taxes, what other deductions, people have health insurance, things of that nature that come out of their paycheck, as we all do. But they are struggling. We are working, clearly, AFG is affiliated with AFL-CIO through all of our union privilege programs. We are working through that, through a network of many labor banks who are offering interest-free loans, as well as working with a lot of federal credit unions who are offering interest-free loans. We have certainly been working with members of Congress that's worked with major lenders in this country to not foreclose, not to take people's cars, not to do those type things, to try to understand that people are, through no fault of their own, are not getting paid. So there's been a large outpouring of people doing and giving things. However, there is a downside to that. We are federal employees. There are laws that actually prevent us from accepting things of even, of a value of maybe more than $20. Someone can give me the exact number, but it's a very small amount of accepting things. And we are calling upon Congress that, sure, we in this instance, as long as this lockout is going on and people are now talking about preparing into March and April of it continuing, yes, we need some type of relief and at least some provision passed by the Congress that these folks, if somebody gives them pizza at the airport or somewhere, that they don't lose their government job. And we all agree, we don't want government employees to be compromised, but those are difficult things. The lawsuit that we have filed, it actually goes back to probably Depression-era days and the establishment of the minimum wage and overtime for hours over 40 hours in a week. The law says if you don't pay an employee at least minimum wage, then they are entitled to damages for that, or if you didn't pay them for their overtime. This lawsuit was filed in the last government shutdown, and we prevailed in the court system. We have filed it again. We believe that it will move forward because while many of these people make more than minimum wage, they did not receive anything, so therefore they didn't get the minimum wage. However, our court systems are shutting down because they're running out of money, and probably by the 1st of February, the court systems will not be operating in this country, so we are coming to a halt with our justice system. And as we all know, in legal lawsuits, these are years sometimes and being resolved. The real answer is the Congress and the President just opening up the government, paying employees to do the job. We can make all these problems go away very, very quickly if we just did that.
So let me ask, because we're live streaming, so it's not just a bunch of policy experts watching us right now. There are some people in the flyover states and places where I grew up who are watching this right now, and a lot of people tweet me or call into different radio shows and ask me these questions. Why don't these federal employees just walk off the job? Some people say that if that happens, then perhaps the government shutdown would end. I know there are legal implications to that. That's not an option. So if you could explain to the American people why that doesn't happen and the dangers of that.
That is not an option. Federal employees cannot walk off the job. They cannot strike. AFGE, I will assure you, NTU, Tony will be right here with me, no union that represents federal employees in any way, shape, or form would encourage that. That is against the law. We will abide by the laws of this country. I can promise you we will abide by them very strongly. We don't have that right. Private sector employees do have that right. federal employees. Congress says we don't have that right. But I also say private sector employers do not have a right to withhold the wages of their employees. The government goes after employers that withholds wages. However, our government has exempted itself from its own laws that it holds all other employers accountable for, and says it don't have to pay employees, and it can require employees to come to work, not be paid, and if the employees don't come, the employees can be subject to adverse disciplinary action, including up to removal of their jobs. So we are being held hostage, my friends, and it's probably a powerful word. Government employees are being held hostage at this point in time, and it is unfair in every way, shape, and form.
Tony, you look like you want to weigh in.
Yes, I will. I do want to weigh in, actually. I am in large measure in agreement with Jay David. Look, let me be really, really direct about this. Federal employees want to go to work. They, true enough, want to be paid for going to work.
Yeah.
And every federal employee understands that they took an oath to the United States of America and to the Constitution of the United States of America. They, when they're told to show up to work, they show up to work. Jay David is exactly right. You cannot strike. You cannot have work actions, job actions, slowdowns, work stoppages, anything of the sort, and no federal union that I'm aware of, and I can certainly speak for NTEU, would ever condone or promote such an idea. Federal employees want to go to work. We've got to get them back to work. We've got to get them paid. And for those who are working through this shutdown, we got to get them paid. They all need to be paid, and now.
So I'm going to start asking some of the questions from the audience. And again, if you have a question, please find one of Chairman Thompson's very capable and awesome, hardworking staffers to ask your questions, and I'm happy to relay them. The first one is for Tim, and the question is, how might the shutdown affect state emergency management, and are there any effects on state and local emergency management grant funding?
Thanks. That's a great question. All of the people that manage the grants that FEMA gives out to state and local governments are furloughed right now. There is no action on granting. For what that means for people, the state and local emergency management agencies operate. The disaster response capability of the nation is a big team effort between state, local, and federal agencies and nonprofit organizations, NGOs. State and local emergency management agencies operate large part on federal grants, a mix of local and state appropriations and federal grants. Those grants that have been previously awarded, the money is in the hands of state and local governments, but new grants are not being awarded. There's nobody there at FEMA to process, to deal with any questions, to load any quarterly funding on. Any pending grants that were about to be given out have stopped. If the shutdown goes on much longer, that puts continued operation of the rest of the nation, state and local governments, in peril as well. In addition to that money, there are billions of dollars in terrorism funding, terrorism preparedness grants. That activity is all stopped. The engine of Homeland Security in the nation kind of runs in a collaborative form, and it's all paused for the time being. Additionally, all the state and local, the millions of responders I mentioned training, those are being trained every year. Those are all state and local first responders, police, fire, EMS. That's all stopped. It may be years before they get an opportunity to get back into, these are advanced anti-terrorism, counterterrorism classes, things in responding to weapons of mass destruction incidents, advanced command and control training. That's not happening. there are widespread impacts across the country beyond just the employees of the federal government.
So, Tim, feel free to pass on this question, but I'm going to ask it. So the president has talked about, they've looked at taking billions of dollars away from FEMA, from important projects around the country, from hurricane recovery to wildfires. And your expertise, having worked at FEMA for 8 years, do you think it's a good use of federal resources to take those funds away from some of these national preparedness emergencies that the country has experienced to build what some would call a superfluous wall?
I'll answer it this way. I won't comment necessarily. Look, I've spent my entire career in emergency management and Homeland Security, including for a number of years before I came to FEMA as a state Homeland Security advisor on the southwest border. I have very strong opinions, I believe strongly in a secure international border, both north and south, that there is a lot of work to be done, a strong border, CBP, strong ports. There's much work to be done, and there's a lot of dedicated, selfless people doing that, and they're the wall. The CBP, the TSA, the Coast Guard, the men and women of Homeland Security are the ones protecting the nation's borders, and they need to be back at work. Insofar as taking money from FEMA, from disaster accounts, from committed, much less committed disasters, where there is active recovery projects going on, should be unconscionable. The way, I mean, we're a country of laws. That money has all been appropriated and awarded pursuant to a whole series of statutes and checks and balances to declared disasters. The disasters that have been declared by the president to be major disasters. Recovery has started. There are commitments to American citizens to rebuild their communities and help get them back on their feet. And it should be unthinkable that that money would be taken away for any kind of political squabble to be put to some other use beyond what it was committed for, be it recovery in Puerto Rico from a hurricane, or recovery in communities devastated by wildfires in California. Politics has no place in disaster response and rebuilding communities after crises. We should let the men and women of FEMA and the women and men of the emergency management community and towns and mayors and governors across the country get on with the work of rebuilding their communities and preparing themselves for the next disaster or terrorist attack.
Thank you for that. This next question is for Caitlin. And forgive me, I'm trying to understand the handwriting. I think a doctor wrote this question. It says, DHS recently issued an emergency directive directing agencies to take certain actions to protect against DNS hijacking activity are to be completed within 10 days. How does the shutdown affect the ability of federal agencies to comply with that directive? I hope I asked that correctly.
As I mentioned early, the important DNS work at departments and agencies for the most part continues to occur, especially the larger departments and agencies that are well staffed. I think where there is some concern are the smaller independent, or the smaller agencies, the smaller independent agencies that may not be as well staffed in their ability to keep up with that. But in speaking to officials yesterday at CISA, I think that we should take some solace that that work is continuing right now.
So if you have any more questions, please find one of Chairman Thompson's very capable staffers to collect your questions. While you think about that, I'm going to ask each of the panelists a question, and I'll start with you, Tim, put you on the hot seat. Something that I've been thinking about, I think a lot of the other people across the country have been thinking about, including the very direct Cardi B, who released a video last week detailing how she's scared. And, you know, like it or not, her language may be a bit vulgar, but it was very accurately capturing the sentiment across the country. And she said she's scared about this government shutdown, and she's scared what will happen. If each of you can talk us through, what is your worst case scenario? What is the thing that keeps you up in the middle of the night? I know, you know, there are people who said, we don't know what the breaking point is, but as best you can, what is the worst case scenario that this country, given that there's no end in sight for this shutdown to end, what is the thing that you think will be the breaking point for this country?
Wow. Well, so, yeah, I mean, the small consideration, right? So in the context of FEMA, as I mentioned kind of in my opening remarks, my big fear is that something of a national consequence, a catastrophic level crisis will happen, and we won't have the people in the building, we won't have people on the job to deal with it. We have exempted a large swath of law enforcement and frontline responders across the country in the furlough, where they're working for free, selflessly. And that's no different at FEMA. But as I mentioned, FEMA is an agency where people do two jobs. Everybody has two jobs. And so in the dispassionate reading of the law of what's considered exempt or non-exempt is based on your day job. So there are a small number of people at the agency who are monitoring situations and can respond to small things. But, I give you an example of a tropical storm coming offshore during a previous shutdown. We haven't had to recall a number of people. Now, it's not hurricane season. So we're fortunate in that regard, but as we like to say, it's always earthquake season, and there are a number of large disasters that can strike the state, that strike the nation that would have that level of impact. Not the least of which would be another large terrorist attack. Having folks on the job, you can't get time back. You can't. You get enough people on the job 3 days after an event or 2 days after an event and make up for that lost time. Time is unrecoverable. You need to get out fast, you need to react quickly and bring the entire coordinated might of the U.S. government to bear on a catastrophic crisis, and I don't believe, can do that today. FEMA's on the back end of two of the busiest years in the history of the agency. We've had the most impactful disasters, hurricane after fire, in the history of the country. FEMA, a small agency of less than 10,000 people, many of which are reservists, not even full-time employees, have been facing extended deployments away from their families in an agency unlike the military where that's not expected. You don't take a job as a grant manager at FEMA expecting to live in a hotel room in Puerto Rico for a year away from your family, unable to get home, missing games and plays, school plays, and deaths of family members and birthdays. And now we're asking them to sacrifice groceries so they can make enough money to maybe make their mortgage payment. That shouldn't be how the most powerful nation on earth manages its business. We need to get people back at work, protect the nation, and pay the people that have chosen to commit their life to public service.
Thank you for that. J. David.
Something that we probably don't talk a whole lot about in Homeland Security, in the Department of Justice, there's close to 150 federal prisons and penitentiaries around this country because most of us don't become face-to-face with those institutions on a daily basis like we do with TSA and other government agencies. We tend to forget about them. They are the major employer in those areas. They're located in rural areas. You usually just don't put a federal penitentiary downtown New York City. they're the major employer. It's not just husband, wife, it's father, son, brothers, sisters, cousins. 90+% of the people in those communities work at those prisons. The other 10% are associated with businesses that are vendors of those prisons. And there are some very, very serious criminals in those prisons that have certainly broken the laws of our country and inflicted harm upon the citizens. What worries me, entire communities going under, that we see people leave, people lose their homes. Once you get underwater with paying your bills, it's going to take a long time to get back out. And if this shutdown, lockout ended today, it would take 7 to 10 days to get most federal employees their paycheck, to give them some money. It would take 3 to 6 months to even sort out owed overtimes, other type things. The systems don't come up that fast. Hiring is stopped. All these type things. A talent pool is not going to be there. So I think there's a lot of devastation, and prisons is only, it comes to mind because it's so unique and a major, major employer in those areas. But still yet, there's 800,000 people that's currently affected, and hundreds of thousands of government contractors. And Tony and I don't talk a lot about government contractors, but these are workers that are not being paid. And I am talking about them more and more because it is just totally unfair to not pay workers. And they do a vital service. There's never a way that every one of these entities is going to be performed by the federal government. And it's branching, it's just growing. So it's a malignancy that's going to grow and get much larger, and I think we will see the effects of this for several years to come.
Thank you for that. And just a point of reference that Senators Mazie Hirono and Tina Smith introduced legislation this week to ensure that contract workers get back pay. It's a Republican-controlled Senate, so we don't know how that vote is going to turn out, but they did introduce the legislation.
And we've certainly, AFG is strongly supporting that legislation and will work as aggressively for that legislation as we have worked for legislation to pay government employees, because all workers ought to be treated fairly.
Thank you. Thank you for that. And Tony.
Yes, thank you for the question. I have to tell you that when I think about just this entire shutdown situation, what first occurs to me is that in the United States of America, think about this. In the United States of America, in 2019, we are requiring federal employees to work and not be paid. And we also have furloughed hundreds of thousands of others. And so, what keeps me up at night is the fact that there are 800,000 federal employees who are not receiving a paycheck. They can't pay their rent, they can't pay their mortgage, they can't put gas in their car, they can't pay for child care, they can't pay the copay so that they can take the insulin to keep themselves alive. And then we have the cascading impact on the communities. So, I often think about the impact on the federal employees, the impact on our country, on the rest of our country, for the services that they should be getting, that they aren't getting, and then, of course, the impact on our nation's economy, which is astounding. So clearly, at the fore of my mind is the impact on my members. the financial impact, the emotional impact, and I think it's important to recognize. So if we take our Customs and Border Protection employees, our CBPOs, for example, they are the most mission-focused people I have ever been around in my entire life. And they are on the job, and they are doing an outstanding job. They're doing the best job that they possibly can. But I think it is only appropriate to understand that when people are worried about whether or not their children are being fed or they're able to pay the mortgage or the rent to keep a roof over their family's head, they might not be thinking in all situations about the stuff that they would ordinarily think about. And I think it's only realistic to consider that things could happen that maybe otherwise wouldn't. I mean, they're there on the job and they're doing the best job they can, but come on, human nature is human nature, right? The other thing that really is of major concern to me as a citizen is the issue of recruitment and retention. I tell people all the time that a story about when I was in high school. I was a foreign exchange student in what was at that time West Germany, and they put me up at the front of the room and they said, let's put this American kid up there and let's ask him some questions. And the very first question I got was, this is how it went. So Tony, why is the American Civil Service the marvel of the world? Well, I was 15 years old at the time. Candidly, I had no idea. What did I know? I was 15, right? Gave an answer, whatever, and I thought, I was kind of embarrassed by that. I thought, I got to find out more about this, and I did, of course. But here's what I found out, that in fact, our civil service and our federal employees are the best in the world. Yeah. But if we are going to treat federal employees like this, if they're going to be subjected to shutdowns every single year, potentially many times a year, if they're going to be subjected to pay freezes, which incidentally, federal employees, as I suspect you all know, are facing in 2019, they got that word, the final word on that, right in the middle of the holidays, in the middle of a shutdown. So if federal employees are going to be facing this sort of treatment, who the heck is going to want to work for the federal government? And oh, by the way, how are you going to retain those folks? And that ought to scare the bejesus out of every single American citizen.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Caitlin, I can't recall a time where our digital infrastructure was in peril in the public eye at this scale. Perhaps you know something privately, but in the public eye at this scale, I can't recall a time. So I'm very curious. What's the worst case scenario in your eyes, and what keeps you up at night?
Tiffany, it's actually less the threats to our digital infrastructure, and I'm going to pick up both on what Jay David said. Tony, it's kind of hard to follow you because I think you did a good job laying it all out. I think one is that someone is unnecessarily harmed or killed, to Tony's point, because our federal workers are distracted. They are worried about making payments, if their kids are cared for, putting food on the table, whatever it may be. And it's not that they're not there to do their job, but when you're under duress, you think about other things. So that's my first concern. But I am very concerned, especially if this drags on into the March and April timeframe, about the economic impact, especially to areas that have large number of federal employees. And I think this, if it continues, represents an existential threat to this region in particular. And you think about all of the ripple and the cascading effects that this has, and the things that when you're not getting a paycheck, you don't do, right? You don't pursue the work on your house. You don't go out to dinner as much. You really watch what you buy at the store. You don't go shopping, right? And then the impact that has on that particular business, and it cascades across. And I don't know, I think the estimate is it's $1 billion a day impact from the shutdown, but it's going to continue to get worse and to be exacerbated. And I think long-term, I mean, this is an incredibly vibrant region, the National Capital Region. I moved here in 1994 after college, and I can't tell you what a different place Washington, D.C. is, and how remarkable it is to be a citizen here and to partake in our museums and our national parks and the culture and the history and the politics that goes on. But who's going to want to come here? And whether it's the small business, right, the person who wants to start the small business, or maybe that college graduate. I was a college graduate who wanted to come and serve my country and make the world a better place. But if there's not that kind of hope and promise of a stable job, the ability to contribute to the mission, it's gonna have an impact, and we have to think about that. I do, hope that we try to make lemonade out of all this and find the silver lining. And I say this with the utmost respect to the two gentlemen to the left of me, but I do think that maybe this is an opportunity, once we guarantee that a shutdown will never happen again, is to think about how we reform our civil service system. And I say that in working very closely with the private sector and knowing that they are working to attract and, poach the talent of the federal government. We have to make it easier for people to come work for the federal government, period, right? We have to, walk the talk and understand that no longer in this day and age do people hold a job cradle to grave, right? That it is very common. I remember, I've been a hiring manager for a long time, and you used to look at people's resumes and be like, they're jumping around jobs every 2 to 3 years, kind of what's wrong with this person? Well, now, it's more concerning if you look at someone and they've been in a job for 15 to 20 years. And so once we resolve the shutdown and ensuring that this never happens again, I think that it is time to work with members of Congress and to kind of rethink the civil service system and to ensure that we can get the best and the brightest here, that they're well paid, that they have benefits, and they have the flexibility that we see in the private sector, which is part of what attracts people to the private sector.
And Kevin Hassett, the White House economic advisor, said we could see 0% economic growth because of the shutdown. Yep. So I take your point. Tony, you wanted to weigh in really quickly?
Yeah, I just wanted to weigh in on the point about civil service reform. See, I think, and J. David can obviously speak for himself, but I think we all have to remember, it wasn't that long ago, it was May of 2018, that the administration put forward 3 executive orders that sought to destroy federal unions and sought to eviscerate employee rights. And, I would expect that most people would say, we're willing to talk, if there's a good faith effort, we're willing to talk about things that can be done to improve our world, right? But when it's difficult for anyone to do that when you have a gun pointed at your head. And so I think that not only do we need to get through the shutdown, but I think we need to get to a place where there is really good faith. There is not a gun held to the heads of federal unions, and where employee rights are under constant attack. I think got to get there before you can actually have any meaningful discussions.
Thank you, and we are being told to wrap, so I'm sorry to get to you last, Peter, but your closing remarks. I know a lot of people are concerned about transportation in this era of a shutdown, so very eager to know what keeps you up at night.
Yeah, well, let me speak from kind of an overarching perspective, and it comes from the fact that my entire career was spent in frontline operating agencies, and that were asked to go do things, law enforcement, emergency response. Those agencies were created because things don't always go right in this world, right? You have bad things that happen, and those bad things can be caused by bad people, or they can be caused by natural events, or they can be caused by some combination of the above. So that's the perspective that I take. And when I think about, and this, in some manner, applies to every agency of the federal government that's currently subject to this shutdown. But I'll talk about the Department of Homeland Security because I spent the latter half of my career in that. I was in the department since it was founded, and that's where I was when I left the federal service. You know, the entire department is focused on prevention. If you think about it, it's about doing everything you possibly can to keep bad things from happening, or to understand the kinds of bad things that happen that you have no control over, like a hurricane or a tornado or flooding or so forth, and then to put as many mitigating efforts in place in advance of that as you can. So it's a prevention focus, but it's got a response imperative, meaning if something does happen, then you've got to be able to respond to it and do it. And those two play together. So to the extent that there's less effort being put into everyday prevention efforts, and there is when you furloughed a number of people, because having been through shutdowns during my time in federal service and on active duty in the Coast Guard, you immediately start figuring out what are the truly essential things that I have to do that I can still afford to pay for using whatever appropriations I have left. Then it's hard to know what to predict might happen because you just didn't pay attention to some things that you used to pay attention to. But I will tell you, it does make the response a lot more challenging than it might otherwise have to be. So it's hard to predict. I mean, I grew up in agencies that expected bad things to happen periodically, but it's hard to predict what a worst case scenario is. I mean, you can look at mission statements of the agencies that have been founded, and you can look at authorizing language to indicate the kinds of things that they were formed to address. But my concern is that you just slowly erode this ability to anticipate, you slowly erode your readiness to respond, and you greatly increase the challenges associated with response when something bad does happen. And on top of that is this very real concern that you may begin to attract fewer people to public service, which I grew up believing was a real calling and an honorable calling. And I still believe it is, and I believe that most of the people, anybody who takes the oath of office believes it is. It goes back to my comment that you know, you do this willingly, and you do it with a great deal of meaning. And I know that when I was in the military, you know, you retake that oath on a regular basis. You take it every time you get promoted or advanced. Often, I worked for one commanding officer who made us retake the oath every single year, and then we would go through line by line and talk about what it really meant, because it was his belief that you need to have eyes open when you do that. But it was also a way to reinforce this very real sense of what it means to be in public service. So I just say, I mean, and I know that's the way people think about it. We did this, you know, I did this, you know, you learn things like that from people and you inflict it on others as you get older. And so I would do the same thing with my members. We did it at TSA, and my fear is that as you erode that sense of that compact that we have with people who perform public service and do the really hard work of this country, sacrifice a lot to do it, spend years away from their families and friends in the course of a career, put their lives on the line, and many do, then you make the response to things that happen significantly more challenging. So that's how I would leave it.
Well, thank you. Thank you all for sharing your expertise. I feel more enlightened. I'm certain the audience does as well. Chairman Thompson is not going to deliver closing remarks, so you're also witnessing history that an elected official has yielded the microphone to somebody. So thank you, Chairman Thompson, for this very important conversation that you're having. I do want to say, out of respect for the chairman, that he has invited the Department of Homeland Security Secretary Nielsen to testify before his committee to answer innumerable questions, and we look forward to her response to your invitation. And, you know, as we talk about these things, it's very important to talk about the policy of all of these things. But I just want to introduce, for the people who might not be policy experts, but for the people who are watching the live stream across the country, the 800,000 people, we keep hearing the 800,000 furloughed workers, but we're really looking at millions of people when you think about their families and contract workers and people who are not going to get their food food stamp benefits and other government benefits. This shutdown has cast a wide shadow across the country, and I want those people, more than anyone else, to know that Chairman Thompson's heart is with you, my heart is with you, the people on this stage, their heart is with you, and we're thinking about you, and this conversation is certainly had with you in mind. And I just, as we get through the minutiae of all that, I just don't want that to be lost as we talk through policy. The president may not have mentioned those people in his remarks, but certainly we're all thinking of you. And I thank you guys for taking time to come to have this very important conversation today. I want to thank the media, because I know in the very busy news cycle, I run a political platform, so I understand that you can be spread very thin and pulled in different directions. And I want to thank you guys for being here to highlight this very important discussion. And the panelists may be around a few minutes after to answer questions that you didn't get a chance to ask. I apologize if I didn't get to your question, but we do have a time constraint and we have to be out of here by noon. So again, please, a round of applause for Chairman Thompson, his staff, who worked very hard to put this on today. And thank you, and let's hope this all ends very soon. Thank you.